When one thinks of Syria these days, what comes to mind? Well, when I think of Syria today, what springs to mind are a lot of issues. For instance, Caesar's law, which was born and bred in the USA many years ago, has kicked in the middle of last month actually, and has begun exponentially to implement sanctions upon the Syrian regime and those international actors that are supporting it. Caesar's law does not aim, as I understand it, toward regime change, but toward a modification of the attitude of the regime vis-à-vis its own citizens. But Syria also means other things to me. It means wildfires. If anybody follows the news on Syria, you can hear about fires destroying agricultural tracts, agricultural products, wheat, for instance, and no wonder that there are already hints of bread shortages with the subsidies and the rationing kicking in. But Syria also these days, for me, means problems within the ruling dynasty itself. One of the strengths of the regime, an Alawite regime, was that it was cohesive, it stood together, it financed each other, it funded its activities, it politically kept their own backs safe. But now we can see fissures, we can see ructions across many, many members of the ruling family. What will happen to this? That's Syria for me. But Syria is also an economy in meltdown. It's a reconstruction of a damaged and destroyed country that is off the agenda at the moment, certainly for the West, and a currency depreciation that today, for instance, the dollar stands at some 3,200 Syrian liras, and an ounce of gold is about 1,800 liras. But finally, for me, Syria, and this is important, is a country with many tentacles, foreign tentacles invading into the country and taking hold. You have Russia, you have Iran, you have Turkey, you have even the United States, and you have many other players and actors who perhaps are not physically active, but very much there financially or politically as well, backing the regime or trying to steer the regime in one direction or the other. But now, if I tell you this, put Syria and the European Union, the EU, together, what happens if you adjoin Syria and the EU in the same phrase? As I've said before on many an occasion, the problem, as far as I'm concerned, is not with the EU in terms of lacking power, certainly soft power, but that it does not use that power. So here is a historicity, as far as I'm concerned, of the EU sanctions on Syria. The European Union has been imposing sanctions since 2011 when we started with the Arab Spring. The current EU sanctions regulations consist of asset freezes, travel bans on designated individuals, as well as imposing a range of financial, trade and transport sanctions. Only in February of this year, for instance, the foreign ministers of the EU unanimously adopted fresh sanctions against the Syrian business persons and 2 Syrian entities because they are financially supporting the Syrian regime and its violent repression of its own people. But does this humanitarian arm of the EU, which at some instances is quite generous in our world today, does it also wield any political influence? Can the banker be a player as well? The EU and its member states are the leading donors of international aid to those affected by the war in Syria. Since the start of 2011, for instance, more than 20 billion euros has been mobilized to support the most vulnerable Syrians inside the country and across the regime. The EU has also been the driving force of the Syria pledging conferences, which took place in Brussels for 4 consecutive years from 2017 to 2020. This year, the European Commission mobilized alone 194 million euros in humanitarian aid, enabling partners to reach millions of people with vital assistance inside Syria. These includes also 40 million to respond to the needs arising from the coronavirus pandemic. So what initiatives have been undertaken by the EU which have some political nous, some political influence to them? I'll just leave 3 for you to mull over. The EU-UN co-hosted the 4th Brussels conference on Syria only recently on the 30th of June, and some 7 billion euros or dollars, my guest might correct me, in pledges have been made. Germany and Belgium were the pen holders in relation to humanitarian aid to the northwest of the country. But as we know from the news, Russia and China vetoed the draft resolution that had already been watered down many times over the past month. And finally, Turkey, which is now playing an increasingly important role in Syria, Turkey is also an important player nowadays, and Turkey-EU relations are turgid and strained. So, does the EU have hard power? Does the EU have soft power? Or does the EU have no power? In which case, what about the geostrategic and geopolitical interests of the European Union? Dr. Ziad Majed is a friend, but he's also an academic at the American University of Paris. He's the author of 2 books on Syria, and he's an analyst of high caliber on both Syria and Lebanon. Besides, he's a hugely busy man with numerous networks. So he joins me again briefly on this 7th episode of Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf regions. Ziad, it is a pleasure to have you with me again, despite all your busy schedule. And what I'm going to do basically is simply give you 4 or 5 minutes to take your time and explain what can the EU do to prove that the EU is a player, not only an occasional banker.
Thank you, Harry, and it's my pleasure to be with you again. In fact, allow me just to add 2 or 3 items to what you started while defining Syria or telling what Syria means to you. There is also a need to say that what's happening in Syria is much more a human responsibility than just a disaster that occurred, in the sense that we have more than 500,000 people killed, we have more than 100,000 who disappeared, and we have more than 50% of the population of Syria that was made either refugees outside Syria or internally displaced. And there are responsibles, there are those who committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. They are documented. There are tens of reports by UN commissions, by Amnesty International, by the EU, by Human Rights Watch, by many other human rights organizations, showing the responsibility of the Assad regime, of Russia and Iran for more than 90% of all the crimes and of all the victims of this conflict. In front of all that, we have seen so far a very hesitant European Union, either because there is no foreign policy for Europe, because this is difficult, because it requires a consensus. So it has been much more easy for the Europeans to be into humanitarian action, into imposing some sanctions, into pushing the UN to take some initiatives and encourage the peace processes or the negotiations that the UN initiated. So they were much more, as you put it, into the support, into the observation, rather than into an aggressive action. aggressive, not militarily, of course, but politically, economically, in the way they might not force, but put lots of pressure to impose specific measures. And Europe is, with all that, the first region that receives, in addition to some countries in the region, the refugees, witness the impact of the Syrian conflict. Internally, this conflict did have an implication when it comes to the rise of xenophobic sentiments, to the rise of far-right groups in different countries because of the refugee question and because of the political Islam question. So there was a strategic interest in Europe to find a solution for the Syrian conflict, and at least to negotiate with some actors in a firm manner what could be done. And unfortunately, we lost many opportunities between Britain, France, and Germany, the three major actors who were connected to the Syrian issue. There were sometimes, as I said before, hesitations. We remember 2013 and the chemical crime that the Assad regime committed, and the non-action of Europe because of the American inaction at the time. What we can keep talking about the missed opportunities, but what we can add today is that Europe can negotiate with Russia a certain political transition in Syria that with time could alleviate sanctions, allow reconstruction, and allow a normalization of the situation with Syria. But that negotiation should consider that the political transition is a must and is the only way to allow for the solution and the reconciliation and the reconstruction. What has been so far the European position on that is what France, Britain, and Germany keep mentioning about the political transition, but without negotiating firmly with the Russians to see how it can happen, what would be the conditions, what would be the European, let's say, offer when it comes to that, how they can negotiate with the United States, with the Trump administration that has been extremely imprevisible and rarely clear about its priorities, except when it comes to Iran, to try to be at the heart of the political question in the sense that they can initiate the negotiations here and there. They can support clearly some initiatives. They can block others when they see that negotiations are turning, as when it comes to the UN mission, negotiations without any progress, and to always condition economic aid to Syria with political progress that can be made only through Russia, the sponsor of the Syrian regime. The second thing is when it comes to impunity. The problem of the Middle East, or at least one of the key problems of the Middle East, is impunity, the non-respect of international law and the absence of consequences for that, whether in the Palestinian-Israeli question or when it comes to many of the Arab regimes who violated international law. And there is a need when it comes to Syria not to keep the international law and some tribunals today in specific countries like Germany, but to make them much more a European consideration that impunity should end in Syria, and that is one other condition for a political solution that could be followed by reconstruction and by the resettlement of refugees and of internally displaced people. But otherwise, Europe will remain just a humanitarian aid donor. That is, of course, very noble and an excellent help or assistance or policy that it can offer, but this is not enough, and it will not lead to a political solution. The key of that solution is in Moscow. The key is in a political transition that will turn the page of more than 50 years of dictatorship and crimes in Syria, and allow for reconstruction, reconciliation, and other questions to be on the table of negotiation.
Ziad, thank you very much. Now, I'm going to be strict with our timing, and I'm going just to shave off another 1 minute or under 1 minute by asking you one question only, which requires 3 or 4 words as an answer. You're in Paris at the moment, I'm in London. You're in the heart of the European Union. We are beginning to walk away from the European Union. After the intro that I made to this issue and the ample answers that you provided, is Dr. Ziad Majed a hopeful person or a less than hopeful person when it comes to the EU in less than 60 seconds?
No, unfortunately, I'm not hopeful for now because of the internal political dynamics, because of the Brexit, because of the rise of the far right, because of electoral years in many countries. And Syria is not a top priority, especially now with the post-COVID-19 economic crisis. So I don't see a serious change. But at the same time, and on the long run, I can't see any solution to the Syrian question and to its implications in Europe itself without a clear European foreign policy and without a clear European approach to the whole Middle East and its different conflicts. I will finish with what Gramsci once said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And I think that's why we both keep working and trying to change things wherever it's possible.
Absolutely. And I will finish with another word, which is one of my favorites, optimism, which also relates to an Arab communist novelist who coined this word, a Palestinian for that matter, many, many years ago. Ziad, it was a pleasure, and thank you very much indeed for your contribution to this episode.
Thank you, Harry. It was my pleasure.